Hi, thank you for having me. So Lisa asked me to talk about better simple charts today, or when she asked, I thought that is an interesting choice. In that, if you know the work in my heyday when I was making charts, as opposed to managing or whatever else it is I do now, I don't think simple is the first adjective that comes to mind, right? Like we were making string graphs and we were making squishy Veroni tree maps. Making connected scatter plots and connected scatter plots of second derivatives of things. This one came back, from the Flash graveyard recently, and I was like, "My goodness, what was going on over there on that stage?" We were making network diagrams that were not just network diagrams, but I was encoding the error in, like, little loops in the connections between people. I was really obsessed, with error for a while. So, simple, I was like, "Simple, that's an interesting choice," but it is also in some ways, a choice of, in my career that does make some sense. About 2 years ago, I left the Times. I joined this little startup in Seattle, where the design ethos is these, like, single little kind of pink, spark lines, single line charts. And about 6 months ago, I joined Bloomberg, and Bloomberg is an organization that makes all kinds of charts. But I think the ones that actually make the money are, like, high frequency line charts. I don't That's not an official statement. I don't know that for sure. Also true, that in my personal life, the charts that I stare at now, are pretty simple charts. The ones I spend the most time with are these ones, out of, Google Sheets about my net worth and my weight that I've taken the labels off to be polite, but very simple charts, and so I thought, "Okay, maybe I have some things to say about better simple charts." So there's 4 things I think, advice that, applies to charts that you make, in Data Wrapper or elsewhere for simple things that I think can make them actually better. The first one I've been preaching for more than a decade, which is to just use your words. My favorite example of that is not something I did myself. It's an example I've stolen from Lee Byron and David McCandless back when Facebook was more popular. They made a chart of, peak breakup times, based on Facebook messages. Except they didn't make the chart that looked like this. They made it actually with an annotation layer. And so if you look at the chart this way, you can see that there's a little Valentine's Day bump, there's a spring break bump. 2 weeks before the holidays, things really pick up and Christmas slows down. And I like this chart because in some ways the topic is so simple, right? Like it's not an advanced thing to recognize that there's some seasonality in this, or if you know when Christmas is or December is, to guess when springtime is. Um, but the annotation layer on it, the words on the chart, make it a completely different experience. And Data Wrapper happens to be one of the few products that actually take annotation seriously and think about ways that can make charts better. My classic other example of talking about this is an old jobs day chart example. Where, normally you can just make a bar chart on jobs day that say like the economy added this many jobs and the unemployment rate is whatever percent it is. This one was before a presidential election, so we were just having some fun, and we said, look, you can put on your Democrat goggles and say there have been 31 months of job growth, and the unemployment rate has fallen more than 2 points since its recent peak, or you can put on your Republican goggles, and you can say, "Look, the economy is at 150,000 jobs a month just to keep up with population growth, and the unemployment rate has been above 8% for 43 months now." That's the sort of, example that these are complicated examples kind of about annotation, about how using the words to actually pretend your chart has a message, uh, changes things a lot or can change things a lot. I realized that in particular, some of the words on charts that are most interesting to me are verbs, and some of the art that is most interesting to me are verbs too. So if you know the artist Richard Serra, you may think of things like this. This is in Bilbao, I think. He makes these like kind of giant steel sculptures, and it's always been a puzzle to me why they are so impressive to me because like ships are kind of the same and, like, ships actually sail in the same way, but, like, I find them stunning, but earlier in Richard Serra's career, when he's trying to figure out what sculpture is or what it is that he's trying to do, he made this list of verbs. Like, what am I actually trying to do here? I'm trying to rotate, to swirl, to support, to hook, to suspend, and I find that verb list really inspiring to think about it, in our own work, that the verbs are the thing that drives something, that the verbs are the words you might use in your chart, in the headline, in the annotation to really change things. When I was first getting started in my career, I spent a couple of years at the Federal Reserve Board, and so you say like, okay, that's fine for artists, but it doesn't apply to the kinds of charts that I am making. At the Fed, there was a list of verbs that people passed around there too about uh, describing the sizes of increases or decreases in increasing order. So something could tick up, inch up, edge up, firm, or it could collapse, plunge, plummet. There's also an accompanying list of adverbs that where you are encouraged to use sparingly. So tad, touch, bit, slightly, those kind of things. So I think that the idea of verbs changing things, being serious about using the verb with your chart instead of just saying, this is a chart of X. Tell me what the chart is actually showing. Changes things a lot. The example that has inspired me most on that recently has been Matt Conlon, who's been playing with aggregating public data and presenting it and visualizing it automatic, right, without human involvement. He's pushing on like some of the AI sentences. And so this week, he said he was proud of a chart, proud of the system that he's been building. They tackled an inflation report. Automatically, this code was able to say like the consumer price index rose like whatever percent, 0.5% last month, and it's surpasses expectations for the fourth consecutive. That kind of context, I believe, makes this a much better chart than if you lose the verbs entirely. If you just say, this is a chart of the consumer price index, all of a sudden, if I don't know much about it, and machines are doing this now by themselves, right? Like you have to be better than this, I think, to want to claim that you should still be in the craft, right? Like you have to do better than the baseline. And so I think use the verbs, use the words is a really important thing. That's my number one tip, especially when I go talk to academics. I say, look, it doesn't need to be a sexy verb that you put in your headline. You don't have to push the bounds of meaning. You can say is doing something, like just whatever I'm supposed to see in the chart. Use a verb. My other advice, especially for academics, especially if you've ever been to an academic poster session and you see how they design their layouts, to think about this. There's no sense of hierarchy at all. And the tip for that is to remember what a cereal box looks like. If you've ever been to an American grocery store, um, you've seen an aisle like this. These boxes, mostly marketing to people who can't read, honestly. So, giant font, maybe a cartoon character, maybe an advertisement of a toy. But there's another side of the box, and then there's the nutrition information on the side of the box where it will tell you, the cereal is actually just like eating half a cup of sugar. Like it's really 50% of sugar is what's in the box. But the thing to note is that information is not the same size as the other information, right? Like you have some control over size. And it's tempting to think in the era of mobile graphics, none of this hierarchy stuff matters anymore. And I think that is completely untrue, right? Like you see, if you kind of some of the classic like design hierarchy things, if you've ever seen this example, probably you read the biggest text first. And then, if it actually works and if it actually kind of feels like magic, if you read the text at the top last, you're like, huh, they have control over me. Even, you have control over how someone else's eyes react to something or how many people, it's not 100% of people. But how many people encounter your work? And so where I think that shows up in charts, where I think that shows up in a charting tool like Data Wrapper, especially is your choice of what the words you are using or what you're using in your headline, right? Um, I am a believer that the headline should tell you what the chart shows. This is a simple chart one of my colleagues made at Bloomberg recently. And the headline, it just tells you what it is. Whatever this bank increased, failing, it made the penalties paid to something else increase, right? That's a concept I don't know anything about, but the headline tells me what's going on in the chart. And both of the newsrooms that I have worked in, the New York Times and Bloomberg, have changed that style, right? At one point at the New York Times, the style for what the headline should be, it was just like a jokey little, it was kind of like you would like kind of throw away words. You would say, a tale of two cities, or like getting warmer question mark or something. It didn't tell you actually what the chart was. It was basically throwaway words. Bloomberg, same idea, but changed that style more recently about what the headline should be. My claim to you is, if you remember the cereal aisle, we're gonna read the biggest thing first. So it's crazy to use that headline to not just tell me what it is. Tell me what the chart is showing. Use a verb in that headline. Use a verb in that space. That's the biggest thing you have. So it should be bigger than less important stuff. In particular, if the units on your chart are less important, that should be definitely smaller, right? Like, and if you think you still have hierarchy, even in a even if you're making a simple chart for mobile out in a tool out of the box, or so if we go back to cereal for a second, this is a chart made from one of my opinion columns, right? Kind of breaking the headline rule a little bit. Like, this is just a chart about how much sugar is in a cereal box, right? Uh, at Bloomberg, the official style right now is to describe what the chart is in a noun in this readout. And that works fine for some charts. For a chart like this, that's like a pretty simple, straightforward chart, I think it's fine, totally fine to use that space to just say, like, this is a chart of sugars as a percentage of the weight of what's in your cereal. Kind of a little bit of cleverness going on here to like introduce one package of cookies amongst the cereal. So that Honey Smacks, the box that we were looking at, it really is like 50%. So, you want to make that information, if you're selling Honey Smacks, smaller than the other information. That is a style using this text here, using the deck, using the readout to describe basically the units of the chart is a perfectly fine choice for a very simple chart. Um, I think when you want to start to get just a tiny bit more complicated, it stops being such a good choice. So, for example, if you look at a chart like this, which is one made by one of my colleagues, which is about how much is sold on Black Friday. Black Friday is a very important retail day in America. So at different stores this year, so Amazon, it's as important as about like 3 average days. Crocs, it's as important. It's like a much higher percentage of their whole sales over a year. So both Amazon and Crocs had a pretty good Black Friday. Their sales rose over the year. But I'm saying to you, this chart is pretty complicated. If I just look at it right now out of the screen, it doesn't really it doesn't work, right? Like, I can't, because I need this space. I need this deck to lend me a hand to tell me what it actually is, and to break Bloomberg style and use that space to actually give me, just use the words to tell me what it is instead of just repeating the units. I never really thought that very much about it before, right? Because I was raised in a certain way about like what should go there. I have beliefs, and sometimes some of my friends send me like kind of taunting examples. Now, this was an example also came under the opinion section. Is an interesting idea, but you'll see this footnote that's like, no, time on y-axis is a 24-hour clock expressed in decimals. And you're like, what is going on over there? Similar, not so dissimilar from that. Like, what is going on in the flash era of the charts we started with? Why that is because as a tool, the charting tool that Bloomberg uses assumes you are putting your unit in this space, whereas the person who made this chart decided instead to use that space to describe what it is. In part, the reason I like Data Wrapper as a product is it gives me control to play by play by reasonable rules within a reasonable set of defaults. So I said, okay, you have 2 minutes. What do you do if you want to keep the units on this chart but make them normal, right? So the way I was raised, you tuck the units in the axes when you can. So you would just say like, here's a time in recognized units that I understand. The other thing I noticed, felt myself wanting to do when I made this chart was that if this chart is supposed to be about younger Americans eating dinner earlier, uh, I should just make it be about younger Americans being earlier, right? Like, I have control over things like the color. And if I want the young line to be the most important, I can clearly make it the most important. And that is tip number 3, which can apply. So use your words. Tip number 1. Tip number 2, remember your cereal box that you have some control over hierarchy, even when you are doing pretty simple things. Tip number 3 is just be brave. My friend Lena Groger, who now is the graphics director at ProPublica, I like some of her slides. She is the one who like crystallized this idea in my own head. And her phrasing of this is don't be a wimp. So if it's going to be different, for goodness sake, make it actually different. And the detail that she filled in for me on that is that like you can't contrast 12-point font with 13-point font. And you can't contrast dark brown with black. So if you're going to be different, make it different. When we talk about this, we often talk about this in terms of design choices, right? Like, so if you're going to make your colors different, make them actually different. If one piece of text is clearly more important than the other piece of text, you want me to definitely read the headline first and definitely read the units only if I'm confused and absolutely need them. Make one a lot bigger and bolder than the other. Make one a lot smaller than the other. But I think it also applies to what is the data that you're putting in your chart. When I was working on this talk, I was thinking about what are the charts that are my favorite. They're the sort of charts that you can make in data wrapper, or you want to make in data wrapper. You should make in a data wrapper or a tool like that. I thought about a chart like this. This is the how effective is the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19. And the reason that this chart is fun is because you don't have to squint at it. Like you don't need the confidence intervals to see that the lines are different. Thought about a chart like this. This is what's the price of sardines you buy on the beach in India before and after the introduction of mobile phones. So before mobile phones showed up in a place, the price was all over, right? Like it was crazy. When phones showed up in a place, like it becomes a true market, and that does a lot to smooth out prices. Um, this chart, I think, is a beautiful example of a chart that lets me do some thinking. So the idea of small multiples about like, okay, if you just told me what happened in this first region, like maybe it's because of phones, maybe it's not because of phones. But then when I start to add the second region, I start to say like, okay, this change that I don't have to squint at, like a bold, non-wimpy change happens over and over and over again. And now I can start to use this that chart as a vehicle for thinking. I also thought a chart like this. This is a distribution of marathon times. I like this one because it's actually about a bigger idea. This one, you'll notice the chart is not smooth. If you think of most like just random histograms, they're very, very smooth. This one, it's lumpy, right? Like there's way more marathon finishers at 4 hours than there are at 4 hours and 1 minute or 4 hours and 2 minutes. And that's because goals are important. So like I think the big idea around this, the data hyper specific, how fast does it take people to run a marathon? But the idea behind it, are arbitrary goals important? Clearly shows like they are. This chart structure is important too. This is another chart that I love. Um, it's about how many people apply to liberal arts colleges in America, depending on how well they're ranked in one ranking. And you see that there's this big drop off at after 50 schools, right? So the top ranked liberal arts school, controlling for some other stuff, gets the most applicants, and then goes down and down and low. And there's a big drop off, and that happens to correspond to where there's a page break in the printed version of these like college ranking guides. So there's actually no difference in the world between the 50th best school and the 51st best school. I like these because, as data, they're structurally interesting, the patterns in them. There's also enough data that you have a chance of seeing if something's wrong or weird, right? Like, I wanna know what some of these dots are. Like, plotted me data that's actually rich enough that I have a chance of understanding the patterns in it, which isn't true which isn't true for all types of forms. Similar kind of one where I wanna know more about the countries. This is someone on Reddit, um, looking at how does the tallest flagpole in a country, does that have any association with the amount of freedom in that country, right? And it turns out the countries with really tall flagpoles, they tend to have places with really low freedom scores, right? It's an interesting idea, but I love seeing the dots, right? Like I just want to know more, and I think good charts do that. They say like, here's one level of detail, give me enough to think about more. I contrast that in some ways to thinking about like kind of a bar chart. You may know that I'm not the biggest bar chart in the world. And that's because when I picture them in my head, I can remember so few of them that actually reveal structure. Right? Like they talk, you should sort it. And then they all kind of look the same. There are times, however, where even bar charts, I close my eyes and I can remember. I remember this chart of the different prices of different liquids, in part because the comparisons are so interesting, right? It turns out that printer ink is about twice as expensive as human blood and way more expensive than vodka and Red Bull and crude oil, right? On a per liter basis. This is a chart that I remember because the choice of what went in it was an interesting choice, right? Like you don't have to stay so confined to data that comes from a single source, that comes from a single place. You see that in the same, like that earlier Bloomberg opinion cereal example. It's fine if it's just a chart of cereals, but once you throw the cookie into it, now it becomes a more fun chart because I have different type sets of knowledge to link it to. If this was just a chart of printer ink, there's no chance I'd remember it. But as soon as it becomes a chart of printer ink and blood, now I remember. It also happens to be a terrible chart. This is a chart that came out of the Excel default in an era when this sort of weird 3D and legendy stuff, like all bad ideas. But I remember it because the choices of the data are interesting. Which leads me to my fourth and penultimate point is think about whether you should. Think about whether you're doing what you're trying to do. Data Wrapper as a tool mostly encourages you to make excellent choices. Like mostly the guidelines are all there. Not all tools do that. So for example, the Bloomberg charting tool, I think encourages people to make a lot of charts like this. This is a chart of how many migrants have new court cases in various parts of the United States. Uh, it's a chart that it's hard to extract a pattern out of. I looked at this chart recently and said, like, what are we actually trying to say with it? Can we just tame this chart into something that has an actual point? So this is a chart that the tool out of the box encourages you to make. You can show all the data. The question here is like, do you need to? Could we be closer to having a point with this chart for existing and extract any meaningful insight out of it at all? If instead of showing all of the data, we just reduced it, we reduced something. Still not a great chart, but it's at least a chart with a message, which I think is one tiny step towards getting better. That's the thing I type most now in my work Slack. I think there's some these false hierarchies in the world that more charts are better in people's heads, and with some of my colleagues too. They'll see these plans and they'll be like, "Here are the 7 different charts I can make," and constantly I'm typing, no, like one good chart is better than like 7 okay charts. And the other false hierarchy I hear a lot is like, especially now that I'm not formally attached to a graphics department, is like that interactive is better than a static chart, which is not true at all, right? And at least not true in terms of some kind of insight. I think I covered this at my last job at USAFacts too. I personally believe, and this is a radical belief, that it's like one of the exceedingly rare places where data wrapper lets people go wrong, or not lets, but encourages people to go wrong some ways. Is a tutorial where it says like, look, I can teach you how to make tab charts, which are appropriate in some places. So like you can have this kind of like false interactivity where you can click on charts. Here's a chart of COVID cases. We made it for Spain, and you could see it for Germany or Italy or whatever. Too. This kind of false interactivity is appropriate for some places where you are just saying, really, here I am to just share the data with you, right? Like this is really a vehicle for you to be responsible, you, the reader, to be responsible for the insight. It's not really on me. I've made it slightly easier for you visualizing it. For a long time, I was showing this doctored screen grab from the New York Times about how silly that would look if on a banner headline day, we titled the whole page, like, just here are some words. There's something in there. That is the equivalent of sometimes what we are doing when we make these dashboard type things, which is okay if you know that is exactly what you are doing. That's my goal. The problem becomes when there's confusion about like whether you're pretending to play in a space where you're offering insight and you're really just making a display of data. Which leads me to my last and final point, and this is a point that I have been playing with in my head a lot lately. It's about my favorite art has fingerprints left in it in some ways, right? The reason been thinking about this is I left the Times about 2 years ago now. Um, I can still tell when an editor there named Jonathan Coram makes a bar chart. Um, and you would think that there's nothing at all in a bar chart where there should be fingerprints of authorship, right? Like where you can recognize a style, where you know exactly. Partially, it's because Jonathan uses this blue in his palette a lot, like way more than anyone else. He often contrasts with this little green, so there's like easy kind of tip offs right away. Partially, it's about the thoughtfulness which he does things. Like Jonathan is a thinker, and so there's always, the labels are always drawn to be exactly where you want them, nothing more, nothing less. He does a really good job of telling you what the chart is trying to show. So, like this one from a few weeks ago was that, people taking this drug have 30 times the odds of reporting abnormal behavior. Like, that is a full sentence. That is not like here's a unit of, some whatever, right? But there's also, like, a delicateness to Jonathan's work that I've never been able, even myself, to be able to quite mimic. And the thing when I look at, like, kind of some of the style transfer work that is going on with AI now, there's part of me that wonders if we are not so far from, anyone being able to pick up that delicateness and some of that intentionality. Like, Matt Conlon has proven to us that the words part is already taken care of or very close to being taken care of and being spread. Like I have an easy time imagining a future where you're at least presented with like options out of the box about like, what is this chart attempting to show, or what is the pattern that you see when that is revealed in this chart. And often with charts, like we saw with that jobs example, there's not a single pattern, there's a few. I also think that innovations are ready to be made in the design space about what is it that Jonathan Coram is doing with the bar chart that makes it so like lovely, and like the hierarchy is right, like you read the first things in the right way. I believe that is getting going to be easier by machine in the not so distant future. In the meantime, if you don't have access to any special technology or any special like thoughts on that, I do think that the thing you can do, no matter what, which is my final takeaway, is just use some verbs. Use verbs in your data wrapper chart headline. Take advantage of the fact that data wrapper's annotation is serious and designed by people with serious charts in mind. And you do that, and you think about if you actually have something to show. Think about if you combine data from a different place entirely, if what you had to show would become more revelatory, more interesting, and you will be well on your way to making better simple charts. So we have a little time left, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any, and if not, we can all have a break.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for your really great examples of driving home so many points. I really like your heuristics. I do spend a lot of time thinking about what really helps people to hear when they create charts, what helps them to create better charts. And so I really liked your heuristics. Like, if you want to make it different, make it different. Headlights should tell you what the chart shows. Yes, definitely my opinion too. One good chart with a clear point is better than seven okay charts. Interactivity isn't necessarily better. I wonder, like, how do you bring these heuristics, like, in this editing process that you're doing? I mean, as I understand it, you've been an editor for such a long time, helping others to create better chart. How do you go about it in practical terms? Do you have any tips for attendees here to hoot other people's charts? What helps them?
I think, the editing of charts and in particular simple charts, it depends where they are, right? Like, so I work with a team now at Bloomberg that is titled there's data journalists. So not focused so much on design, on data visualization, is more in the reporting and the analysis. That comes out of a field where I have been astounded by like the number of bar charts that I see that are not sorted. And I'm like, good grief, where did you people like where is your background? What is this coming from? Right. And so some of it is that kind of like, really just thinking about what is it that I'm attempting to show in this thing. My current test is like, do I want to talk about this at dinner? And that's partially more in the idea space than in the graphical design space. And then my other thing is asking yourself, like, do I need it all? Right? Like, there's a temptation sometimes to be like, here, my advice for people like editing really simple charts is to get good enough at a tool, and it doesn't matter what the tool is. My favorite, actually, truly, I'm not just saying this because we're at Data Wrap, it is Data Wrapper, to be in a place where you can make the chart almost as quickly as you can think, right? For a relatively simple chart. So you want to be able to try on choices. You want to be able to iterate. And so for me, when it's sketching with data, like totally on process that used to be R, and really now it's often closer to Data Wrapper, is that like you just try it on and then you're looking for the best one. And then when you're editing, it's also thinking about like, what are the units on this chart? Like, do I actually understand it? Do I understand thinking a question in your head? Do I understand where this data came from? Right. So there's sometimes like a tendency to just be like, source Bloomberg, and I'm like, maybe that's true, but like Bloomberg probably got it from somewhere else. So like, are we actually using the space in the way that we could use the space? And so, editing of charts, I think, really is mostly in my field, which is not true for everyone's field, but is mostly about, does this have a sharp point? If it doesn't have a sharp point, is there data that we should throw away or acquire to make it have a sharp point? Or are the design choices that we can make to make it have a sharp point? So could we emphasize something? Like, if you have a sharp point, you should emphasize that sharp point. If you're like, no, it's all like equal hierarchy, like maybe that's okay for what you're trying to do, but maybe you need to think more about what you're trying to do with this chart as opposed to just, we have some data and we could make a chart. So I think that's my number one editing tip is like, It's not about arranging the data in a space, it's arranging a data such that some pattern or comparison to scale or some insight is clearer. And maybe you have a chart, maybe you don't have a chart, maybe you need to do more reporting to get a different chart. When you're reporting the data, you want to be thinking about structure if you want to make good charts, right? Like you want it to be deep enough so that if there is a true pattern, you can see the true pattern. That's all messy, but it's the answer really is like it depends. It depends what the chart is.
That's some great advice. Thank you. We actually start to get some questions from the audience too. Let's get this one up from Elliot. Great talk, Amanda. Thanks so much. In my experience, it's easier to sell 7 mediocre charts to editors rather than one great chart. What's your advice for pitching a letter?
If you work in an organization that has scroll depth, you can say like no one's even going to read the last four charts, right? Like, and we know that not no one, but rounds to no one in reality in the version of what if you are making public facing internet content. If you're working a different job, I cannot speak for you. So like, uh, is is anyone actually going to read it? I think it's also helpful sometimes to have the comparison side by side. And so like here's the one good one. We could also like tack 8 things on the bottom, but, go home and sleep on it and tell me tomorrow what you remember. And, like, by the time tomorrow you remember, that's like, "Oh, yeah, there were just, like, charts I could scroll through." Like, I can it's not a thing, so, my advice is, like, 1, uh, accept that the way the internet works now not entirely, like, there are people actually thinking in a thread of 7 charts. So, I'm not opposed to 7 charts in general. Like, if you think of, like John Burnrock is a master of this, right? Like he makes these Twitter threads where the charts actually build on each other. So if you got to make 7, I think, some in like, you just have a boss who's just a mediocre person and just thinks that 7 is better. You can say like, okay, I can rise to that occasion and think about how do these build on each other and end up as tools for thinking as opposed to like miscellaneous things strung together. And then I would say, I bet if you look at the analytics of whatever your organization is, I bet it will be clear that the top chart gets at least twice and possibly 10 times as many eyeballs as the bottom chart. And so that is one argument that is possible to make too.
Thanks. Perfect. Okay, we have another one from Catherine Smith. In which cases do you think interactivity is a good call?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro interactivity. Like interactivity is definitely a good call when people want to find themselves in a chart, right? So there's certain types of data that I remember, and this is many years ago, but one of my colleagues Sean Carter had first had children, and his editing philosophy changed, like, thinking about school because he was like, I just want all the data. I want all of it possible, and I wanna know everything possible about my situation." There are also cases, where people you expect them to bring a lot of knowledge to the thing. So I'm thinking about in the United States, there's things like census data and neighborhoods and block level data where it's really me thinking about, the context that I know as a human being and can bring to this chart is gonna make it such a personalized local view, is the thing that is really helpful. I think there's other cases where the detail is interesting or helps you understand things that are wrong, like some of the examples that we looked at today like that Reddit one, like, I do wanna know what the countries are that have, the shortest flagpole or the highest flagpole and the lowest amount of freedom, right? And you could get those on with labels, but if you start to think instead of, like, 30 countries or whatever that is, if I had 200, like, at that point, like, where the detail is actually helpful, like, I think when you want to drill into the detail, that's another case for it. Gregor has made this argument super well, he has a lovely talk on it, pushing back many years ago about like kind of the anti-interactivity space, saying like, no, it's useful for thought, it's useful for catching errors. And so if you want to think more about this, I would definitely encourage you to, I think it's called like in defense of interactivity or something. And it's very thoughtful and very good. And I co-sign everything that Gregor says in that.
Yeah, agreed. Me too. Um, we have 2 more questions about text and data visualization. I mean, you made lots of points about that. Use your words, use verbs. Leon Homan is asking, I see many colleagues using only 1 or 2 keywords for a chart and don't tell what the chart is about. On the other hand, you can have way too much text and visualization. How can I find the right balance?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna depend probably on what the chart is and who your users are, like how much hand-holding they actually need. Like that is in some ways like a different case sometimes for some of the interactive stuff. Like I'm not a personal fan of the like storytelling era, but there are times where you can build it up, right? Like where you can say like, look, first you want to understand this, and now you want to understand something a little bit more, and that's a way that like you don't have to dump all of the text at once, but you can like you can build on it and, like, make it more palatable. I think the context, the right amount of text, there's not an exact answer because for some data, that's super easy. Well, how much sugar is in a box of cereal? I don't need much help. I don't need much hand-holding. Like, I don't need many words, right? Like, I got it. Okay, let's move on, right? For some things, like that chart we looked at about penalties paid in the federal home loan banking system, and the first I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I need more words, right? Like, I need you to help me understand. So, the right amount of text is the amount that you need to understand it. I think if you have too much, you can think about like, should this be two charts? Like, do I don't have to do everything in one chart. Like, can I do some of it this way and then like maybe highlight something else and do it in a different way? The too few text is probably easier to solve and that like just add more text, right? And the balance is going to depend on how complicated is the thing that you're trying to show. How familiar is your audience with the thing that you're trying to show? And then do you are you trying to do too much, right? Like, there's a simple like, in the answer, if that is true, then you can just try less hard, right? Like, and win at a smaller problem if you have the opportunity to change the problem.
Great. Okay. We have another one from Yobi Dai wondering how you write a title or subtitle for the chart. I mean, I guess you already shared a lot of advice for that one, but maybe he means more like in practical terms. Maybe there's something you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is interesting that, like, to think about, um one kind of practical tip, is to just, like, turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them what the chart is about, and then, like, type that into the box in whatever software you are using to make the chart, right? That is better than, like, thinking too deeply about, what there are bonus points, right? For chart headlines, you get a bonus point if you keep it to 1 line, 1 mobile line, so keeping it very short if you can, or 2 lines, if you need to at most, I think, in terms of some of the practical how. And then the subtitle, it's gonna depend what your style is. Like, I said earlier, the Bloomberg official house style, you're just describing it, just describing kind of what more unit it's more of a unity like kind of thing, or like exactly a noun phrase about what you're trying to say. Works super well for very, straightforward, simple things. What I was trying to say with that Black Friday example doesn't work well at all when the pattern's more complicated. And so, probably maybe wherever you work has an official style. I am kind of a rule breaker, so you can break the rules if it's not working. If you understand the rules, you can break them as soon as you understand them. As long as you understand, like, am I am I doing this with intentionality? And the how is like it's again related to the same questions of like what do I want to see in this chart? Or what do I think this chart actually reveals, not what to want to see, like, have control over what it shows, but what if you're going to spend more time with your chart if you're working in most contexts than any individual reader. And so to respect them, you spend 10 minutes staring at it and say, here are the most interesting things that this chart shows, or the one most interesting thing. It's a very simple chart. You're dedicated to mobile. You don't have room to do them all. This is the point that this chart supports or reveals or raises questions about or whatever it is.
Mhm. Thanks. We have another very practical question from People Chatterjee. Hi, Amanda. How do you face a map versus chart situation? Would you make a map where a chart could tell the story quicker?
Yeah, I mean, people do like map, right? Like, it's interesting. I forget. I think it's Kim Reese. This is actually her idea about like why are maps so attractive is because they're space filling, right? Like they actually do a good job in the design. Like they fill all the pixels of the shape that or not all the pixels, but because like some countries have better aspect ratios for phones than other countries. But the real answer though is, are you trying to show geographical data? Um, is geographical patterns the most important thing? In a map, already out of the gate, you've given up your two most important dimensions. You've given up your x dimension and your y dimension by just showing the geography. So, in making that choice, you are declaring geography is the most important part of this. I think sometimes it's the wrong choice. So for example, the work that has the most eyeballs on it. It's election night work in a newsroom. There, the question I think that traditionally graphics were answering was where are candidates winning? And I think that is not the question I actually care about on election night. The question I care about is who will win. And where did the person who won? That's a different question than who will win. And so, if the question is really about where something happened, you should make a. It's also true that maps, in some cases, can be like semi-efficient displays of like lots of data. So, for example, like there are 50 states in the United States. A 50-state bar chart, it gets kind of deep. It gets kind of boring, right? If I don't really care that much about precision, if it's just about like it's a lot in these places and it's a little in these places, I can probably do that in tighter space with a map, but I lose a ton of precision. And so, so if you don't really care about precision, map might be more space efficient solution depending on the units that you're showing. Or more appropriately, is it about geography? Because you've given up your best dimensions out of the gate to geography and not about the data that you're showing. So the thing that you're showing with the data better really actually be about geography if you're making a map.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever heard it expressed so clearly. That's super
Yes.
helpful. You do have a lot of strong opinions, which is great. But so Jeff is wondering, what have you changed your mind about?
Oh, I changed my mind about all kinds of things. The interactivity is one of them, right? Like, if you remember that example from the beginning, I didn't describe it, but it was the crazy one that looked like a scribble, right? Like just and that was about econ data. It was about recessions. It was about what stage of the business cycle we are in. I remember Steve Duenas, who was running the graphics department at the time. I was never like the world's best interactive developer, but I would dabble a little bit occasionally, and it was really important to me that you have a slider on the bottom of that so that you could change the time range to like any arbitrary thing that you wanted. And like Steve was like, just cut the slider, just make it like basically like it's just a tour of this. Like you were no, I was like, I remember fighting with him. I was like, this is the most important thing. If we cut this, it's pointless. And like now I looked at him and I was like, what a moron I was about that. And about, a lot of us are a lot of the choices in that era too. The parts of that era that hold up are the mobile ones where we had to like really be like really strict about the editing choices that we made and really edit things down instead of like being like kind of like bad interface designers, right? And so that is like we should have just been like, mobile first the whole time. And part of that is just about the change of what the era is, right? I think some of me now is really drawn to like more, you know, insight stuff. And so that just change of taste and change of era a little bit too. So
Thanks. And related to that, Janneke Berg is wondering which was the most difficult lesson for you to learn in the world of database, if any.
I'm sure there have been many, many difficult ones. Um, I think what's the most difficult lesson? Because I've spent so much of my career in news, uh, the lesson there is just that, like, news always wins, right? That, like, you don't control, like, what actual like, the most important thing is, today. And so that being drawn more to breaking news than sort of like these kind of like weird thought experiments is still a lesson that I struggle with a little bit, but that just news always wins is a lesson. It's not a data viz a broad question, but it's data viz in the context of my career, and I totally acknowledge that some of these points may be the wrong points for people using data viz in other contexts, right? Like that it is context dependent. So that is one for me that it's still I don't know that I fully learned it yet, but it's still a struggle in my.
All right. See, we have another question. Maybe a quick one. What are your thoughts on using double access? Data web doesn't allow them. Do you think there are good use cases for it, especially given the complexity of economics data?
This is actually a super interesting question in my current job. in that at Bloomberg currently, Bloomberg is a bunch. It has a lot of different teams doing a lot of different things, a lot of different norms and cultures. Like they're all kind of related, right? People at Bloomberg officially use, I think it's like, there's two main charting tools and then like four auxiliary charting tools. So like it's a series of mergers that never really finished, right? And one of the big, in the terminal, designed for especially clients, especially sophisticated clients. Um, the dual axis charts are an option. People use it. People love it. People think that way, right? In the more newsroom oriented public web facing charting tool, they are not allowed. That option is not. Um, those tools, they're merging, right? To be more design consistent, which Bloomberg has work to do on. And so as I've made clear, my job is not really even about charts right now. It's about more the analysis, the reporting, data driven side of things. So I visited the Hong Kong bureau. You're hiring in Hong Kong. I was like, it would be good to step foot in that country before you hire someone there. So I visited there, and my colleagues there were like, not even my colleagues, but people on these other teams. All they wanted to talk about was whether the new charting tools would have dual axes, would allow dual axes, and I was like, "Not my job." Like, this is so weird. But, like, people really deeply care about this. So, my answer to that is it depends on the context of, like, who you are showing the charts to. There are fields where these are normal. People understand the ability to, cheat with them, right? There are, there's also places in the world where you might be harder. So, my own view is that like most of the time, stacking a chart is not going to be that much worse, right? Like you just make one chart, you stack it on top of the other chart, like it will show you the same basic thing. There are examples where I think it's cleaner and the actual access is more helpful. My answer to them was like, if you want it, you can probably still cheat, right? Because if you're making a dual axis chart, you probably don't care that much about what the actual units are. So just index both of your series to something and then plot it as an index. This is an index of, whatever benchmark to 2007. Like I think there are ways if you're the tool of choice does not allow dual axis charts and you want it as a user, I believe most of the time you can cheat to get it for yourself by just changing the data such that it's something indexed to something. And if you need to rebase something into something, then like or divide it by whatever, you can get there. Is my own. So depends on the context, depends on who your audience is. I acknowledge that there are audiences in the world for which this is a normal thing in their field, and they feel like they've learned how to read it, and so for them, probably makes sense.
Thanks. And then I'm gonna ask you 2 more questions if that's okay for you. One
Yeah.
of them is a quick one. This one isn't it. You have always been an inspiration to me. Do you think artificial intelligence will design better graphics than us?
That is my hope, right? Like, that's like in part, I have never been an amazing designer, right? I say the New York Times was my journalism education and it was my design education. Not a bad place for either. Like, but I was lucky enough to have colleagues who are much better designers than me. What I was trying to say with that Jonathan Coram bar chart, that blue bar chart at the end, I think no one, no artificial intelligence will ever design a more graceful, thoughtful, not ever. In my lifetime, I'm getting old now, so in my lifetime, artificial intelligence will not design a more delicate, lovely, thoughtful bar chart than Jonathan Coram. I believe it's possible that artificial intelligence is able to capture 80% of Jonathan's magic and therefore will develop a better bar chart than me. Is my actual belief. I've talked to Lisa a tiny bit about this too. I believe DataWrapper is one of the companies best positioned to do this because of the log of charts that go from, here's a something I pasted in from my Excel spreadsheet or whatever to actual publication. Like that actual data, I believe is gold in thinking about. So when you say better than us, I think not better than the great masters, but better than the 80th percentile people by now. I don't think we're even that far away from that. I think we are 3 years, 5 years, 7 years away from that. Is my own belief. So yes, if yes, if us means me, no, if us means Jonathan Court is my answer to that.
Perfect, thanks. And here's the last one, a quick one. The lab wants to know if you could only recommend one database book, what would it?
One data viz, what would it be? I have a cheaty answer to this. That it's about it's a subject matter specific book, right? It's not about data viz. It's about whatever you are charting in the data viz that you are making to actually understand the domain knowledge. Domain knowledge is the book that I would recommend as opposed to charting knowledge. It's domain knowledge.
That's a nice diplomatic answer. All right. Thank you so, so much, Amanda, for coming on here. Thanks for all the wisdom you shared with us. It was great having you here.
Thank you for having me.